As international pressure mounts on Tehran, the Iranians deploy their paramilitary forces to the Persian Gulf, threatening to close the strategic Strait of Hormuz. Sabotage, naval mines, and deniable attacks start to weigh heavily on shipping lanes. And as the freedom of navigation comes under threat, the White House deploys its fleet to cripple the Iranian Navy. This is not the summer of 2019, but the winter of 1984. The standoff between Washington, Baghdad, and Tehran would eventually be known as the Tanker War of the 1980s, and by the end of the hostilities, hundreds of civilians would be lost at sea, in addition to hundreds of damaged merchant ships, all setting a precedent for the present situation in the Persian Gulf. I'm your host Shirvan, and welcome to Caspian Report. High-level anonymity on the internet can be quick and easy with NordVPN. Since the company is registered in Panama, no logging data is provided to ISP operators. So, if you want to ensure your cyber privacy, especially if you travel internationally or use public Wi-Fi's, consider NordVPN. Just go to nordvpn.com/CaspianReport. If you select the 3-year plan, you'll get up to 80% off with the promo code CaspianReport, plus you'll get an extra 4 months free. For most of the 20th century, the Strait of Hormuz has been described as the jugular of the world economy. About 40% of the world's seaborne crude oil passes through the choke point, accounting for 90% of the Persian Gulf crude oil exports. At its narrowest crossing, the strait is only 32 kilometers wide and thus serves as a critical vulnerability in the interconnected world economy. Aware of this geopolitical reality, Tehran has long sought to assert its hegemony over the Persian Gulf, seeing it as a bargaining chip to ensure the survival of the government. In the wake of the Second World War, crude oil became crucial to America's power projection. Since much of the oil came from the Persian Gulf, Washington designed the twin-pillar defense doctrine, which ensured the freedom of navigation within an American framework by closely working with Riyadh and Tehran. For a while, it worked, but the Iranian Revolution of 1979 usurped the status quo and plunged the region into a geopolitical free-for-all. Long-held territorial claims between Iran and Iraq ignited into the public, including the dispute over the Shatt el-Arab waterway. Further anxiety stemming from the revolutionary Iranian leadership, which called on Iraqi Shiites to overthrow the secular government in Baghdad. Months on end, tensions continued to climb between the two. Finally, Saddam's government decided to act on the post-revolutionary chaos gripping Iran, and on September 22, 1980, Iraqi tanks, backed by fighter planes, artillery, and several mechanized divisions, rolled into Iranian territory. Rather than finding the Iranians in disarray, however, Iraq was met with a population and military that quickly consolidated against the external threat.
These people here, these people who come here to fight, they just, they've left their families, they've left their houses. Just they want to come here just to fight the Iraqis. But your country is now helping Iraq, right? But why? You see these people? How old is he? How old is this guy? Must be 14 or something. But he's come here to fight. He's left his mother, he's left his father.
Within days of the Iraqi surprise attack, Tehran responded by shelling port cities along the southern coast of Iraq, crippling the Iraqi ability to export oil by sea and denying the Iraqi fleet control over the Strait of Hormuz. The ploy worked. Within a month, the Iraqi advance lost its steam, and both sides entrenched themselves in conditions bitterly reminiscent of the First World War. For the highly motivated Iraq and the ideologically driven Iran, a peace settlement was out of the question. In this fight, the winner would take all. As hostilities drew on, Tehran and Baghdad desperately looked to less conventional means of breaking the stalemate. In Iran, the failure of the conventional military tactics led to the impeachment of President Bandi Sadr, while paramilitary forces such as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps filled the political void of power in the capital. As such, in late 1981, Tehran was the scene of a covert civil war where any semblance of a civilian body of governance was henceforth excluded from decision-making. By 1982, however, a reinvigorated Iran, now commanded by the religious elite, pushed the Iraqi army out of Iranian territory. For the first time since the conflict began, the Iranians had the upper hand, and in their confidence, they refused to negotiate a peace settlement and were hell-bent on exporting the Islamic Revolution abroad, precisely the sort of thing the Iraqis had sought to forestall with their preemptive attack. Elsewhere in the region, the Gulf states of the Arabian Peninsula, who had previously been cautious of Iraqi nationalism, rushed to provide support to Baghdad by permitting the export of Iraqi crude oil through their ports. Faced with the inability of the Iraqi Navy to wrest back control of the Strait of Hormuz, Saddam sought to internationalize the conflict. Policymakers in Baghdad knew that provoking Iran into closing the Hormuz Strait would result in an international response in Iraq's favor. As such, in early 1984, Iraq began targeting Iranian shipping. As predicted, Tehran responded to such attacks in kind, utilizing the Iranian Air Force to strike Saudi and Kuwaiti tankers. All the while, increasing calls for peace from the international community fell on deaf ears. By December 1985, the crisis had claimed the lives of more than 200 sailors, with 161 ships having been rendered inoperable. With reports of attacks increasing with every passing day, the United States and the Soviet Union became increasingly poised to intervene. Then, on the 10th of February, the Iraqi military was taken by surprise when 30,000 Iranian paramilitary troops captured the Al-Faf Peninsula overnight. With the entirety of the Iraqi coastline now under Iranian occupation, Baghdad redoubled its efforts to internationalize the conflict and exponentially increased attacks on Iranian cities, infrastructure, and shipping. As the number of civilian casualties stacked up, Ayatollah Khomeini established a new paramilitary navy with a new mission, targeting all ships within the Persian Gulf. Armed with light weaponry and naval mining equipment, the naval component of the Iranian paramilitary force immediately began a campaign of piracy throughout the Persian Gulf. Their objective was to choke the Iraqis into submission by making shipping inaccessible. By July 1986, increasing attacks on merchant ships led the Kuwaiti government to formally request protection from the locally operating American and Soviet navies. In the context of the Cold War, neither superpower could refuse, and both Washington and Moscow subsequently increased their presence in the Persian Gulf. As the sea became increasingly crowded, accidents were bound to occur. Ironically though, it was the Iraqis who caused the first accident when on 17th of May 1987 an Iraqi jet fighter struck an American frigate, killing 37 sailors and immediately plunging the Reagan administration into a political controversy. Even though the accident was the fault of the Iraqis, President Reagan mobilized a naval task force codenamed Operation Earnest Will, with the aim to protect Kuwaiti shipping while pressuring Tehran to abide by the principle of freedom of navigation within the Persian Gulf, leaving a far more malleable Saddam open to negotiation. Being a global naval power, the freedom of navigation was fundamental to uphold America's global power, and anyone who violated that principle had to be held accountable. Seen through this lens, Operation Earnest Will can be seen as an example of modern gunboat diplomacy. But to the deeply pious Ayatollah, such combat was a test of the revolution and the Shia resolve. Tehran would not yield. Eventually, in September 1987, the civilian government of President Khomeini, not to be confused with Ayatollah Khomeini, approached the UN General Assembly with the intention of negotiating a ceasefire. While diplomacy was doing its work, however, an Iranian paramilitary mining vessel was captured mid-operation by US Navy SEALs. It should be noted that at the time, both Khomeini and Khamenei commanded different aspects of the military, and it's unknown whether or not the paramilitary force was operating with the knowledge of the civilian government. Regardless of the details, the incident wholly discredited Iran's standing in the eyes of the international community. Humiliated, discarded, and faced with no alternative, Tehran continued its policy of aggressive confrontation. Washington responded by targeting and destroying offshore platforms suspected of being used by the Iranian paramilitary force as staging platforms.
That took a new turn today when American warships shelled and destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms and then raided another. It was in retaliation for the weekend missile attack by Iran on an American-flagged tanker.
The US retaliatory attacks eventually culminated in Operation Praying Mantis in April 1988, when, in the largest naval engagement since the Second World War, the US Navy destroyed half of Iran's operational fleet. It was a strategic disaster for Tehran. Crippled at sea, the Iranian forces on land were driven from the Al-Faf Peninsula roughly a month later. Further tragedy befell the Iranian people in July 1988 when a US missile cruiser mistakenly targeted and destroyed an Iranian civilian airliner, killing all 290 passengers.
Almost simultaneously, another apparent attack is identified.
15 miles.
Its SAM missile is fired unknowingly not at a warplane but a passenger jet.
Got it. That was a dead on.
290 civilians died, and with them, Iran's hopes of victory. Its leaders now believing the superpowers would stop at nothing to prevent Iraq losing.
To the apprehension of the leadership in Iran, the international response was mute. By then, it was clear that the fight was over. 8 years of trench warfare had corrupted the revolutionary zeal that had once drawn Iranian martyrs to the front line. Meanwhile, Saddam's government was headed for bankruptcy. By the time a peace treaty was signed in August 1988, the tanker war had incapacitated 546 merchant ships, resulting in the deaths of 430 sailors. Beyond these statistics, the tanker war showcases numerous geopolitical realities. Foremost, not every action deserves a reaction. Iraq had set a trap and Iran fell for it, which decisively affected the outcome of the armed conflict. Secondly, asymmetrical warfare, as opposed to conventional combat, is the strength of Iran. Its paramilitary forces, both at land and at sea, are its most lethal force. But that effective power comes at a cost, and the leadership in Tehran does not entirely shape the behavior of the paramilitary command. Finally, the tanker war illustrates Washington's commitment to the freedom of navigation, a red line that cannot be bent without consequences. Only by learning from these past events can we negotiate our way out of future conflicts. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Special thanks to Alexander Pertin for helping me write this report. If you want to gain access to some special perks like PDF files with sources or early access for peer reviewing, check out our Patreon page for more. In any case, thank you for your time and Sahol.